Chapter 12 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Circumstantial evidence. Interest was beginning to thicken. The people in court, from Simon Crood, pompous and aloof in his new grandeur of chief magistrate, to Spizey the bellman, equally pompous in his ancient livery, were already open-mouthed with wonder at the new and startling development. But the sudden advent of the young and pretty domestic, whose tears betrayed her unwillingness to come forward, deepened the interest still further. Everybody leaned forward towards the centre of the court, intent on hearing what the girl had to tell. She, however, paid no attention to these manifestations of inquisitiveness. Standing in the witness box, a tear-soaked handkerchief in her hands, half sullen, half resentful of mouth and eye, she looked at nobody but the coroner. Her whole expression was that of a defenceless animal, pinned in a corner and watchful of its captor. But this time it was not the coroner who put questions to the witness. There had been some whispering between him, Hawthwaite, and Meeking, the barrister who represented the police authorities, and it was Meeking who turned to the girl and began to get her information from her by means of bland, suavely expressed, half-suggesting interrogatories. Winifred Wilson, 20 years of age, housemaid at Dr. Wellesley's, been in the doctor's employ about 14 months. "Did you give certain information to the police recently?" asked Meeking, going straight to his point as soon as these preliminaries were over. "Information bearing on the matter now being inquired into?" "Yes, sir," replied the witness in a low voice. "Was it relating to something that you saw in Dr. Wellesley's house on the evening on which Mr. Wallingford was found dead in the Mayor's Parlour?" "Yes, sir." "What was it that you saw?" The girl hesitated. Evidently on the verge of a fresh outburst of tears, she compressed her nether lip, looked fixedly at the ledge of the witness box. "Don't be afraid," said Meeking. "We only want the truth. Tell that, and you've nothing to be afraid of, nor to reproach yourself with. Now, what did you see?" The girl's answer came in a whisper. "I saw Dr. Wellesley." "You saw your master, Dr. Wellesley? Where did you see Dr. Wellesley?" "On the hall staircase, sir." "On the hall staircase? That, I suppose, is the main staircase of the house? Very well. Now, where were you?" "Up on the top landing, sir." "What were you doing there?" "I'd just come out of my room, sir. I'd been getting dressed to go out." "And how came you to see your master?" "I heard a door open on the landing below, sir, and I just looked over the banister to see who it was." "Who was it?" "Dr. Wellesley, sir." "Dr. Wellesley. What was he doing?" "He'd just come out of the drawing-room door, sir." "Are you sure he'd come out of that particular door?" "Well, sir, I saw him close it behind him." "What happened then?" "He stood for a minute, sir, on the landing." "Doing anything?" "No, sir, just standing." "And what then?" "He went downstairs, sir." "And disappeared?" "He went towards the surgery, sir." "How was the staircase lighted when you saw all this?" "Well, sir, there was a light in the hall, at the foot of the staircase, and there was another on the drawing-room landing." "Then you could see Dr. Wellesley quite clearly?" "Yes, sir." "How was he dressed?" "He'd his surgery jacket on, sir, a white linen jacket." "You saw Dr. Wellesley quite clearly, wearing a white linen jacket, and coming out of the drawing-room door. Now I want to ask you about the drawing-room. Is there another room, a small room, opening out of Dr. Wellesley's drawing-room?" "Yes, sir." "How big is it?" "Well, sir, it's a little room, not very big, sir." "What is it used for? What is there in it now?" "Nothing much, sir. Some bookcases and a desk and a chair or two." "Is there a door on its farther side, the side next to the Moot Hall?" "Yes, sir." "Have you ever seen it open?" "No, sir, never." "You don't know where it gives access to?" "No, sir." "Might be a cupboard, eh?" "I always thought it was a cupboard door, sir." "Very good. Now I want you to be very particular about answering my next question. What time was it when you saw Dr. Wellesley come out of his drawing room?" "It would be just about 7:45, sir." "Are you quite sure about that?" "Quite sure, sir." "Did anything fix the time on your mind?" "Yes, sir. At least I heard the clock strike the 6:15." "You're sure it was 7:45 that you heard?" "Yes, sir. Quite sure." "Why are you quite sure?" The witness reddened a little and looked shyly aside. "Well, sir, I'd got to meet somebody outside the house at 7:45," she murmured. "I see. Did you meet him?" "Yes, sir." "Punctually?" "I might have been a minute late, sir. The clocks had done striking." "Very good. And just before they began to strike you saw Dr. Wellesley come out of his drawing room door?" "Yes, sir." Meeking suddenly dropped back into his seat and began to shuffle his papers. The Coroner glanced at Cotman, and Cotman, with a cynical smile, got to his feet and confronted the witness. "Was it your young man that you went out to meet at 7:45 that evening?" he asked. "Yes, sir," admitted the girl. "What's his name?" "Joe Green, sir." "Did you tell Joe Green that you'd just seen Dr. Wellesley come out of his drawing room?" "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because I didn't think anything of it, sir." "You didn't think anything of it? And pray, when did you begin to think something of it?" "Well, sir, it was when the police began asking questions." "And of whom did they ask questions?" "Me and the other servants, sir." "Dr. Wellesley's servants?" "Yes, sir." "How many servants has Dr. Wellesley?" "4, sir, and a boy." "So the police came asking questions, did they? About Dr. Wellesley. What about him?" "Well, sir, it was about what we knew of Dr. Wellesley's movements on that evening, sir where he was from 7:30 to 8:00. Then I remembered, sir." "And told the police?" "No, sir, not then. I said nothing to anybody at first." "But you did later on. Now, to whom?" The witness here began to show more signs of tearfulness. "Don't cry," said Cotman. "Whom did you first mention this to?" "Well, sir, it was to Mrs. Lane. I got so upset about it that I told her." "Who is Mrs. Lane?" "She's the lady that looks after the Girls' Friendly Society, sir." "Are you a member of that?" "Yes, sir." "So you went and told Mrs. Lane all about it?" "Yes, sir." "What did Mrs. Lane say?" "She said I must tell Mr. Hawthwaite, sir." "Did she take you to Mr. Hawthwaite?" "Yes, sir." "And you told him all that you have told us now?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Lane said I must." "You didn't want to, eh?" Here the girl burst into tears, and Cotman turned to the Coroner. "I have no further questions to put to this witness, sir," he said, "but I would make a respectful suggestion to yourself. That is, that my client, Dr. Wellesley, should be called at once. We know now that the police have been secretly working up a case against Dr. Wellesley. In fact, I am very much surprised that, ignoring these proceedings altogether, they have not gone to the length of arresting him. Perhaps that's a card which Superintendent Hawthwaite still keeps up his sleeve. I may tell him, on behalf of my client, that he's quite welcome to arrest Dr. Wellesley and bring him before the magistrates whenever he likes. But as Dr. Wellesley's name has been very freely mentioned this morning, I think it will be only fair, sir, that he should be allowed to go into that box at once, where he will give evidence on oath." "If Dr. Wellesley elects to go into the box," interrupted the Coroner, "I shall, of course, warn him in the usual way, Mr. Cotman. He is not bound to give any evidence that might incriminate himself, but no doubt you have already made him aware of that." "Dr. Wellesley is very well aware of it, sir," replied Cotman. "I ask that he should be allowed to give evidence at once." "Let Dr. Wellesley be called, then," said the Coroner. "That, of course, perhaps, will be best." Brent inspected Wellesley closely as he stepped into the witness box. He was a well set up, handsome man, noted in the town for his correct and fashionable attire, and he made a distinguished figure as the centre point of these somewhat sordid surroundings. That he was indignant was very obvious. He answered the preliminary questions impatiently. There was impatience, too, in his manner as after taking the oath he turned to the Coroner. It seemed to Brent that Wellesley's notion was that the point-blank denial of a man of honour was enough to dispose of any charge. This time the Coroner went to work himself, quietly and confidentially. "Dr. Wellesley," he began, leaning over his desk, "I need not warn you in the way I mentioned just now. I'm sure you quite understand the position. Now, as you have been in court all the morning, you have heard the evidence that has already offered itself. As regards the evidence given by your assistant, Dr. Carstairs, as to your movements and absence from the surgery between 7:30 and 7:49, is that correct?" Wellesley drew himself to his full height and spoke with emphasis. "Absolutely." "And the evidence of the young woman, your housemaid, is she correct in what she told us?" "Quite." The Coroner looked down at his papers, his spectacled eyes wandering about them as if in search of something. Suddenly he looked up. "There's this matter of the handkerchief, or portion of a handkerchief," he said, "picked up, we are told, from the hearth in the Mayor's Parlour, where the rest of it had been burned. Did you hear Mrs. Marriner's evidence about that, Dr. Wellesley?" "I did." "Is what she said or suggested correct? Is the handkerchief yours?" "I have never seen the handkerchief, or rather the remains of it. I heard that some portion of a handkerchief, charred and blood-stained, was found on the hearth in the Mayor's Parlour, and that it had been handed over to Superintendent Hawthwaite, but I have not had it shown to me." The Coroner glanced at Hawthwaite, who since the opening of the court had sat near Meeking, occasionally exchanging whispered remarks. "Let Dr. Wellesley see that fragment," he said. All eyes were fixed on the witness as he took the piece of charred and faintly stained stuff in his hands and examined it. Everybody knew that the stain was from the blood of the murdered man. The same thought was in everybody's mind. Was that stain now being critically inspected by the actual murderer? Wellesley suddenly looked up; at the same time he handed back the fragment to the policeman who had passed it to him. "To the best of my belief," he said, turning to the Coroner, "that is certainly part of a handkerchief of mine. The handkerchief is one of a dozen which I bought in Paris about a year ago." A murmur ran round the crowded court at this candid avowal. As it died away, the Coroner again spoke. "Had you missed this handkerchief?" "I had not. I have a drawer in my dressing room full of handkerchiefs, several dozens of them. But, from the texture, I am positive that that is mine." "Very well," said the Coroner. "Now, about the evidence of Mr. Walkershaw. Did you know of the door between your house and the Moot Hall?" "Yes. So did the late Mayor. As a matter of fact, he and I, some time ago, had it put to rights. We both used it. I to go into the Moot Hall, he to come and see me." "There was no secrecy about it, then?" "Not between Wallingford and myself, at any rate." The Coroner took off his spectacles and leaned back in his chair, sure sign that he had done. And Meeking rose, cool and level voice. "Dr. Wellesley, I think you heard the evidence of Mrs. Saumarez?" But before Dr. Wellesley could make answer, the other doctors present in the court room were suddenly called into action. As the barrister pronounced her name, Mrs. Saumarez collapsed in her seat, fainting. Chapter 13 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This recording is in the public domain. A woman intervenes. In the midst of the commotion that followed, and while Mrs. Saumarez, attended by the doctors, was being carried out of the court room, Tansley, at Brent's elbow, drew in his breath with a sharp, sibilant sound that came near being a whistle. Brent turned from the withdrawing figures to look at him questioningly. "Well?" he said. "Queer!" muttered Tansley. "Why should she faint? I wonder " "What?" demanded Brent, as the solicitor paused. "I'm wondering if she and Wellesley know anything that they're keeping to themselves," said Tansley. "She was obviously nervous and frightened when she was in the box just now." "She's a nervous, highly strung woman, so I should say from what bit I've seen of her," remarked Brent. "Excitable." "Well, he's cool enough," said Tansley, nodding towards the witness box. "Hasn't turned a hair. Meeking'll get nothing out of him." The barrister was again addressing himself to Wellesley, who, after one glance at Mrs. Saumarez as she fainted, had continued, erect and defiant, facing the court. "You heard Mrs. Saumarez's evidence just now, Dr. Wellesley?" asked Meeking quietly. "I did." "Was it correct?" "I am not going to discuss it." "Nor answer any questions arising out of it?" "I am not." "Perhaps you will answer some questions of mine. Was there any jealousy existing between you and the late John Wallingford, of which Mrs. Saumarez was the cause?" Wellesley hesitated, taking a full minute for evident consideration. "I will answer that to a certain extent," he replied at last. "At the time of his death, no. None." "Had there been previously?" "At one time, yes. It was over." "You and he were good friends?" "Absolutely. Both in private and public I mean in public affairs. I was in complete touch and sympathy with him as regards his public work. Now, Dr. Wellesley, I think that for your own sake you ought to give us some information on one or two points. Mrs. Saumarez said on oath that you asked her to marry you 2 or 3 times. She also said that the late Mayor asked her too. Now " Wellesley suddenly brought down his hand on the ledge of the witness box. "I have already told you, sir, that I am not going to discuss my affairs with Mrs. Saumarez, nor with the late Mayor in relation to Mrs. Saumarez," he exclaimed with some show of anger. "They are private and have nothing to do with this inquiry. I shall not answer any questions relating to them." "In that case, Dr. Wellesley, you will lay yourself open to whatever conclusions the jury chooses to make," said Meeking. "We have already heard Mrs. Saumarez say what she did say. But as you won't answer, I will pass to another matter. You have already told us that the evidence of your assistant, Dr. Carstairs, is correct as to your movements between 7:30 and 8, or rather, as to your absence from the surgery during those 19 minutes. You adhere to that?" "Certainly. Carstairs is quite correct." "Very well. What were you doing during that time 19 minutes?" "For the most part of the time, in my drawing room." "What do you mean by most part of the time?" "Well, I should say 3 parts of it." "And the other part?" "Spent in letting a caller in and letting the caller out." "By your front door?" "No, by a side door a private door." "You took this caller to your drawing room?" "Yes." "For a private interview?" "Precisely." Meeking allowed a minute to elapse, during which he affected to look at his papers. Suddenly he turned full on his witness. "Who was the caller?" Wellesley drew his tall figure still more erect. "I refuse to say." "Why?" "Because I am not going to drag in the name of my caller. The business my caller came upon was of a very private and confidential nature, and I am not going to break my rule of professional silence. I shall not give the name." Meeking again paused. Finally, with a glance at the Coroner, he turned to his witness and began to speak more earnestly. "Let me put this to you," he said. "Consider calmly, if you please, what we have heard already from previous witnesses, and what you yourself have admitted. Mrs. Saumarez has sworn that you and the late Mayor were rivals for her hand, and that there was jealousy between you. You admit that Mrs. Marriner is correct in identifying the burnt and blood-stained fragment of handkerchief found in the Mayor's Parlour after the murder as your property. You also acknowledge the existence of a door communicating between your house and the Moot Hall. You further admit that you were away from your surgery for 19 minutes, at the very time the murder was committed, according to medical evidence, and that you were in your drawing room from an inner room of which the door I have just referred to opens. Now, I suggest to you, Dr. Wellesley, that you should give us the name of the person who was with you in your drawing room?" Wellesley, who during this exordium had steadily watched his questioner, shook his head more decidedly than before. "No," he answered promptly. "I shall not say who my caller was." Meeking spread out his hands in a gesture of helplessness. He turned to the Coroner, who for the last few minutes had shown signs of being ill at ease and had frequently shaken his head at Wellesley's point-blank refusals. "I don't know if it is any use appealing to you, sir," said Meeking. "The witness—" The Coroner leaned towards Wellesley, his whole attitude conciliatory and inviting. "I really think it would be better, doctor, if you could find it in your way to answer Mr. Meeking's question." "I have answered it, sir," interrupted Wellesley. "My answer is no." "Yes, yes, but I don't want the jury to get any false impressions, to draw any wrong conclusions," said the Coroner a little testily. "I feel sure that in your own interest—" "I am not thinking of my own interest," declared Wellesley. "Once again, I shall not give the name of my caller." There was a further pause, during which Meeking and the Coroner exchanged glances. Then Meeking suddenly turned again to the witness box. "Was your caller a man or a woman?" he asked. "That I shan't say," answered Wellesley steadily. "Who admitted him or her?" "I did." "How? By what door of your house?" "By the side door in Piper's Passage." "Did any of your servants see the caller?" "No." "How came that about? You have several servants." "My caller came to that door by arrangement with myself at a certain time 7:30, was admitted by me, and taken straight up to my drawing room by a side staircase. My caller left when the interview was over, by the same way." "The interview, then, was a secret one?" "Precisely. Secret, private, confidential." "And you flatly refused to give us the caller's name?" "Flatly." Meeking hesitated a moment. Then, with a sudden gesture, as though he washed his hands of the whole episode, he dropped back into his seat, bundled his papers together, and made some evidently cynical remark to Hawthwaite, who sat near to him. But Hawthwaite made no response; he was watching the Coroner, and in answer to a questioning glance he shook his head. "No more evidence," whispered Tansley to Brent, as Wellesley, dismissed, stepped down from the witness box. "Whew! This is a queer business, and our non-responsive medical friend may come to rue his obstinacy. I wonder what old Seagrave will make of it. He'll have to sum it all up now." The Coroner was already turning to the jury. He began with his notes of the first day's proceedings, and spent some time over them, but eventually he told his listeners that all that had transpired in the opening stages of the inquiry faded into comparative insignificance when viewed in the light of the evidence they had heard that morning. He analysed that evidence with the acumen of the cute old lawyer that everybody knew him to be, and at last got to what the sharper intellects among his hearers felt, with him, to be the crux of the situation. Was there jealousy of an appreciable nature between Wallingford and Wellesley in respect of Mrs. Saumarez? If there was, and he brushed aside rather cavalierly Wellesley's denial that it existed at the time of Wallingford's death, estimating lightly that denial in the face of the fact that the cause was still there, and that Wellesley had admitted that it had existed at one time, then the evidence as they had it clearly showed that between 7:30 and 7:49 on the evening of the late Mayor's death, Wellesley had ready and easy means of access to the Mayor's Parlour. Something might have occurred which had revivified the old jealousy; there might have been a sudden scene, a quarrel, high words. It was a pity, a thousand pities, that Dr. Wellesley refused to give the name of the person who, according to his story, was with him during the 19 minutes' interval which— "Going dead against him," whispered Tansley to Brent. "The old chap's taken Meeking's job out of his hands. Good thing this is a coroner's court. If a judge said as much as Seagrave saying to an assize jury, gad, Wellesley would hang. Look at these jurymen. They're half dead certain that Wellesley's guilty already." "Well?" muttered Brent. "I'm not so far off that stage myself. Why didn't he speak out and be done with it? There's been more in that love affair than I guessed at, Tansley. That's where it is. The woman's anxious enough, anyway. Look at her." Mrs. Saumarez had come back into court. She was pale enough and eager enough, and it seemed to Brent that she was almost holding her breath as the old Coroner, in his slow, carefully measured accents and phrases, went on piling up the damning conclusions that might be drawn against Wellesley. "You must not allow yourselves to forget, gentlemen," he was saying, "that Dr. Wellesley's assertion that he was busy with the caller during the fateful 19 minutes is wholly uncorroborated. There were several 4 or 5, I think domestic servants in his establishment, and there was also his assistant in the house, and there were patients going in and out of the surgery, but no one has been brought forward to prove that he was engaged with a visitor in his drawing room. Now, you are only concerned with the evidence that has been put before you, and I am bound to tell you that there is no evidence that Dr. Wellesley had any caller—" A woman's voice suddenly rang out, clear and sharp, from a point of the audience immediately facing the Coroner. "He had! I was the caller." In the excitement of the moment Tansley sprang to his feet, stared, sank back again. "Good God!" he exclaimed. "Mrs. Mallett! Who'd have thought it?" Brent, too, got up and looked. He saw a handsome, determined looking woman standing amidst the closely packed spectators. Mallett sat by her side. He was evidently struck dumb with sudden amazement, and was staring open mouthed at her. On the other side, 2 or 3 men and women, evidently friends, were expostulating with the interrupter. But Mrs. Mallett was oblivious of her husband's wonder and her friend's entreaties. Confronting the Coroner, she spoke again. "Mr. Seagrave, I am the person who called on Dr. Wellesley," she said in a loud, clear voice. "I was there all the time you're discussing, and if you'll let me give evidence you shall have it on my oath. I am not going to sit here and hear an innocent man traduced for lack of a word of mine." The Coroner, who looked none too well pleased at this interruption, motioned Mrs. Mallett to come forward. He waved aside impatiently a protest from Wellesley, who seemed to be begging this voluntary witness to go back to her seat and say nothing, and, as Mrs. Mallett entered the witness box, turned to Meeking. "Perhaps you'll be good enough to examine this witness," he said a little irritably. "These irregular interruptions! But let her say what she has to say." Mrs. Mallett, in Brent's opinion, looked precisely the sort of lady to have her say, and to have it right out. She was calm enough now, and when she had taken the oath and told her questioner formally who she was, she faced him with equanimity. Meeking, somewhat uncertain of his ground, took his cue from the witness's dramatic intervention. "Mrs. Mallett, did you call on Dr. Wellesley at 7:30 on the evening in question the evening on which Mr. Wallingford met his death?" "I did." "By arrangement?" "Certainly, by arrangement." "When was the arrangement made?" "That afternoon. Dr. Wellesley and I met in the market place about 4 o'clock. We made it then." "Was it to be a strictly private interview?" "Yes, it was. That's why I went to the side door in Piper's Passage." "Did Dr. Wellesley admit you himself?" "Yes, he did, and he took me straight up to his drawing room by a side staircase." "No one saw you going in?" "No, nor leaving either." "Why all this privacy, Mrs. Mallett?" "My business was of a private sort, sir." "Will you tell us what it was?" "I will tell you that I had reasons of my own my particular own for seeing Dr. Wellesley and the Mayor." "The Mayor? Did you see the Mayor there?" "No, I meant to see him, but I didn't." "Do you mean that you expected to meet him there in Dr. Wellesley's drawing room?" "No, Dr. Wellesley had told me of the door between his house and the Moot Hall, and he said that after he and I had had our talk, I could go through that door to the Mayor's Parlour, where I should be sure to find Mr. Wallingford at that time." "I see. Then did you go to see Mr. Wallingford?" "I did." "After talking with Dr. Wellesley?" "Yes, he showed me the way, opened the door for me." "Stay, what time would that be?" "About 7:35 or so. I went along the passage to the Mayor's Parlour, but I never entered." "Never entered? Why, now, Mrs. Mallett?" "Because, as I reached the door, I heard people talking inside the parlour, so I went back." Chapter 14 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This recording is in the public domain. Whose voices? Meeking, who by long experience knew the value of dramatic effect in the examination of witnesses, took full advantage of Mrs. Mallett's strange and unexpected announcement. He paused, staring at her. He knew well enough that when he stared other folk would stare too. So for a full moment the situation rested. There stood Mrs. Mallett, resolute and unmoved, in the box, with every eye in the crowded court fixed full upon her, and Meeking, still gazing at her intently, and, of set purpose, half incredulously. There was something intentionally sceptical, cynical, in his tone when at last he spoke. "Do you say, on oath, that you went through the door between Dr. Wellesley's house and the Moot Hall to the Mayor's Parlour that evening?" "To the door of the Mayor's Parlour," corrected Mrs. Mallett. "Yes, I do. I did." "Was the door closed?" "The door was closed." "But you say you heard voices?" "I heard voices within." "Whose voices?" "That I can't say. I couldn't distinguish them." "Well, did you hear the Mayor's voice?" "I tell you I couldn't distinguish any voice. There were two people talking inside the Mayor's Parlour anyway, in loud voices. It seemed to me that they were both talking at the same time. In fact, I thought—" "What did you think?" demanded Meeking, as Mrs. Mallett paused. "Well, I thought that, whoever they were, the two people were quarrelling. The voices were loud, lifted, angry, I thought." "And yet you couldn't distinguish them?" "No, I couldn't. I might have recognized the Mayor's voice, perhaps, if I'd gone closer to the door and listened, but I didn't stay. As soon as I heard what I have told you of, I went straight back." "By the same way to Dr. Wellesley's drawing room?" "Yes." "What happened then?" "I told Dr. Wellesley that the Mayor had somebody with him, and that they appeared to be having high words, and as I didn't want to stop, he suggested that I should come again next evening. Then I went home." "In the same way, by the private door into Piper's Passage?" "Exactly." "Did Dr. Wellesley go downstairs with you and let you out?" "He did." "See anybody on that occasion?" "No, no one." Meeking paused, and after a glance round the table at which he was standing, looked at his notes. "Now, Mrs. Mallett," he said presently, "what time was this? I mean, when you left Dr. Wellesley's?" "A little before 7:45. The clock struck 7:45 just after I got into my own house." "And where is your house?" "Next door to the Moot Hall. Dr. Wellesley's house is on one side of the Moot Hall, ours is on the other." "It would take you a very short time, then, to go home?" "A minute or two." "Very well. And you went to Dr. Wellesley's at 7:30?" "Just about that." "Then you were with him most of the time you were there, in his drawing room?" "Certainly. All the time except for the 2 or 3 minutes spent in going to the Mayor's Parlour." "Talking to Dr. Wellesley?" "Of course. What do you suppose I went for?" "That's just what I want to find out," retorted Meeking, with a glance that took in the audience, now all agog with excitement. "Will you tell us, Mrs. Mallett?" Mrs. Mallett's handsome face became rigid, and her well-cut lips fixed themselves in a straight line. But she relaxed them to rap out one word. "No." "Come now, Mrs. Mallett. This is a very serious inquiry. It is becoming more serious the more it becomes mysterious, and it is becoming increasingly mysterious. You have already told us that you went secretly to Dr. Wellesley's house in order that you might see him and afterwards the Mayor, Mr. Wallingford. Now, you must have had some very special reason or cause for these interviews. Tell me what it was. What was it, Mrs. Mallett?" "No, that's my business, nobody else's. I shall not say." "Does Dr. Wellesley know what it was?" "Of course. Would the Mayor have known if you'd seen him?" "Considering that that was the object I had in wanting to see him, of course he would," retorted Mrs. Mallett. "I should think that's obvious." "But you didn't see him, eh?" "You know very well I didn't." "Pardon me, madam," said Meeking, with lightning like promptitude. "I don't know anything of the sort. However, does anyone else know of this business?" "That, too, is my concern," declared Mrs. Mallett, who had bridled indignantly at the barrister's swift reply. "I shan't say it." "Does your husband know of it?" "I'm not going to say that either." "Did your husband, who I believe is one of the Town Trustees, did he know of your visit to Dr. Wellesley's house on this particular occasion?" "I'll answer that. He did not." "Where was he while you were at Dr. Wellesley's? Had you left him at home?" "No, he had gone out before I went out myself. As to where he was, I should say he was either at the Conservative Club or at Mr. Simon Crood's. Is it relevant?" Amidst a ripple of laughter, Meeking made a gesture which signified that he had done with Mrs. Mallett, and she presently stepped down from the witness box. Meeking turned to the Coroner. "I want to have Dr. Wellesley in that box again, sir," he said. "Let Dr. Wellesley be recalled," commanded the Coroner. Wellesley, once more in the full gaze of the court, looked vexed and impatient. Those who had occasionally glanced at him while Mrs. Mallett was giving her evidence had observed that he showed signs of being by no means pleased at the turn things had taken since her sudden intervention. Sometimes he had frowned, once or twice he had muttered to himself, and he now looked blackly at Meeking as the barrister once more confronted him. "You have heard the evidence of the last witness?" asked Meeking abruptly. "All of it," replied Wellesley. "Is it correct as to details of time?" "So far as I recollect, quite." "When Mrs. Mallett went by the private door between your drawing room and the Moot Hall to see the Mayor, what did you do?" "Waited for her in my drawing room." "How long was she away?" "5 minutes, perhaps." "Had you made any appointment with the Mayor on her behalf?" "No, I had not." "You sent her to see him on the chance of her finding him there, in the Mayor's Parlour?" "There was no chance about it. I knew as a good many other people did that just then Wallingford spent almost every evening in the Mayor's Parlour." "Have you ever visited him in the Mayor's Parlour during these evening attendances of his?" "Oh, yes, several times." "By this communicating door?" "Certainly, and he had made use of it in coming to see me." "Do you know what the Mayor was doing on these occasions? I mean, do you know why he spent so much time at the Mayor's Parlour of an evening?" "Yes. He was going as thoroughly as he could into the financial affairs of the Corporation." "Now I want to put a very particular question to you, with the object of getting at some solution of this mystery. What was Mrs. Mallett's business with you and the Mayor?" "I cannot reply to that." "You won't give me an answer?" "I won't. Do you base your refusal on professional privilege, doctor?" "No, not at all. Mrs. Mallett's business was of an absolutely private nature. It had nothing whatever to do with the subject of this inquiry. I tell you that on my honour, on my oath. Nothing whatever." "You mean directly?" Meeking threw a good deal of significance into this question, which he put slowly, and with a peculiarly meaning glance at his witness. But Wellesley either did not see or affected not to see any significance, and his answer came promptly. "I mean precisely what I say, as I always do." Meeking leaned across the table, eyeing Wellesley still more closely. "Do you think, knowing all that you do now, that it had anything to do with it indirectly? Indirectly?" Self-controlled though he was, Wellesley could not repress a start of surprise at this question. It was obviously unexpected, and it seemed to those who, like Brent and Tansley, were watching him narrowly, that he was considerably taken aback by it. He hesitated. "I want an answer to that," said Meeking, after a pause. "Well," replied Wellesley at last, "I can't say. What I mean by that is that I am not in a position to say. I am not sufficiently acquainted with let me call them facts to be able to say. What I do say is that Mrs. Mallett's business with me and with Wallingford that evening was of an essentially private nature, and had nothing whatever to do with what happened in the Mayor's Parlour just about the time she was in my drawing room." "That is, as far as you are aware?" "As far as I am aware, yes. But I am quite sure it hadn't." "You can't give this court any information that would help to solve this problem?" "I cannot." "Well, a question or two more. When Mrs. Mallett left you at your door in Piper's Passage I mean when you let her out, just before 7:45, what did you next do?" "I went upstairs again to my drawing room." "May I ask why?" "Yes, I thought of going to see Wallingford in the Mayor's Parlour." "Did you go?" "No. I should have gone, but I suddenly remembered that I had an appointment with a patient in Meadowgate at 10 minutes to 8 o'clock. So I went back to the surgery, exchanged my jacket for a coat, and went out." "On your oath, have you the slightest idea as to who killed John Wallingford?" "I have not the least idea. I never had." Meeking nodded, as much as to imply that he had no further questions to ask. When his witness had stepped down, he turned to the Coroner. "I should like to have Bunning, the caretaker, recalled, sir," he said. "I want to ask him certain questions which have just occurred to me. Bunning," he continued, when the ex sergeant had been summoned to the witness box, "I want you to give me some information about the relation of your rooms to the upper portion of the Moot Hall. You live in rooms on the ground floor, don't you? Yes? Very well, now, is there any entrance to your rooms other than that at the front of the building the entrance from the market place?" "Yes, sir. There's an entrance from St. Lawrence Lane at the back." "Is there any way from your rooms to the upper floors of the Moot Hall?" "Yes, sir. There's a back stair from our back door." "Could anybody reach the Mayor's Parlour by that stair?" "They could, sir, certainly, but either me or my wife would see them." "Just so, if you were in your rooms. But you told us in your first evidence that from about 7:20 or so until 8 o'clock you were smoking your pipe at the market place entrance to the Moot Hall, where, of course, you couldn't see your back door. That correct? Very well. Now, while you were at the front, was your wife in the rooms at the back?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know what she was doing?" "I do, sir. She was getting our supper ready." "Are you sure she never left the house your rooms, you know?" Bunning started. Obviously a new idea had occurred. "Aye!" said Meeking with a smile. "Just so, Bunning. You're not sure?" "Well, sir," replied Bunning slowly, "now that I come to think of it, I'm not. It never occurred to me before, but during that time my missus may have been out of the place for a few minutes or so to fetch the supper beer, sir." "To be sure. Now where does Mrs. Bunning get your supper beer?" "At the Chancellor Vault, sir, round the corner." Meeking turned quietly to the Coroner. "I think we ought to have Mrs. Bunning's evidence," he remarked. It took 10 minutes to fetch Mrs. Bunning from her rooms in the lower regions of the old Moot Hall. She came at last, breathless and in her working attire, and turned a wondering, good natured face on the barrister. "Just a little question or two, Mrs. Bunning," he said half indifferently. "On the evening of the late Mayor's death, did you go out to the Chancellor Vaults to fetch your supper beer?" "I did, sir, just as usual." "What time?" "A bit earlier than usual, sir 7:30. "How long were you away?" "Why, sir, to tell you the truth, nigh on to half an hour. I met a neighbour at the corner at—" "Exactly. And stopped chatting a bit. So you were out of your rooms in the Moot Hall that evening from 7:30 to nearly 8 o'clock?" "Yes, sir." Meeking gave the Coroner a glance, thrust his hands into his pockets, and dropped back into his seat, silent and apparently satisfied. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Special Edition. But if the barrister was satisfied with the possibilities suggested by this new evidence, the gist of which had apparently altered the whole aspect of the case, the coroner obviously was not. Ever since Mrs. Mallett had interrupted his summing up to the jury, he had shown signs of fidgetiness. He had continually put on and taken off his spectacles, he had moved restlessly in his chair, now and then he had seemed on the point of interrupting counsel or witnesses. It was evident that things were not at all to his liking. And now, as Meeking sat down, the coroner turned to Mrs. Bunning, who stood, looking wonderingly about her, and still fingering the apron in which she had been found at her work. "Mrs. Bunning," he said, "I want to ask you some questions about this back entrance of yours. What is it, a door opening out of the rear of the Moot Hall?" "Yes, sir, that's it, sir." "Does it open on St. Lawrence Lane?" "Yes, sir." "What does it open into, a hall, lobby, passage, or what?" "A lobby, sir, next to our living room." "Is there a staircase, then, in that lobby? I mean, by which you can get to the upper rooms in the Moot Hall?" "Oh, yes, sir. That's the staircase we use, me and my husband, when we go up for cleaning and dusting, sir." "Then if anybody went in by that door while you were out that evening, whoever it was could go up that staircase to the upper rooms?" "Oh, yes, sir, they could." "And get to the Mayor's Parlour?" "Yes, sir. The staircase opens on to the big landing, sir, and the door of the Mayor's Parlour is at the far end of it." "And you were out of your rooms for half an hour that evening?" "Just about that, sir. It would be a bit after 7:30 when I went out, and it was just before 8 when I went in again." "Did you notice anything that made you think that somebody had been in?" "Oh, no, sir, nothing." "Had you left your door open, your outer door?" "Yes, sir, a bit ajar. Of course I never thought to be away many minutes, sir." "Very good. That's all, thank you, Mrs. Bunning," said the Coroner. He looked round the court. "Is the Borough Surveyor still there?" he asked. "Mr. Walkershaw? Let him come into the witness box again." But the Borough Surveyor had gone, nor was he to be found in his office in another part of the building. Once more the Coroner looked round. "I dare say we are all quite familiar with what I may call the geography of St. Lawrence Lane," he remarked. "But I want some formal evidence about it that can be put on the record. I see Mr. Krevin Crood there. I believe Mr. Crood is as big an authority on Hathelsborough as anybody living. Perhaps he'll oblige me by coming forward." Krevin Crood, sitting at the front of the densely packed mass of spectators, rose and walked into the witness box. The Coroner leaned confidentially in his direction. "Mr. Crood," he said, "I think you're perfectly familiar with St. Lawrence Lane, in its relation to the immediately surrounding property?" "I am, sir," replied Krevin. "Every inch of it." "Just describe it to us, as if we knew nothing about it," continued the Coroner. "You know what I want, and what I mean." "Certainly, sir," assented Krevin. "St. Lawrence Lane is a narrow thoroughfare, about 80 to 90 yards in length, which lies at the back of Mr. Mallett's house I mean the bank premises, the Moot Hall, and Dr. Wellesley's house. Its north entrance, at the corner of the bank, is in Woolmarket, its south in Strand Lane. On its west side there is a back door to the bank house, another into Bunning's rooms on the basement of the Moot Hall, a third into the police office, also in that basement, a fourth into the rear of Dr. Wellesley's house. On the opposite side of the lane, the east, there is nothing but St. Lawrence's Church and churchyard. St. Lawrence's Church tower and the west end faces the back of the Moot Hall. There is a part of the churchyard opposite the bank premises, the rear premises. The rest of the churchyard faces Dr. Wellesley's house. The back of it, of course." "Is the lane much frequented?" "No, sir. It is very little used, except by tradesmen going to Mr. Mallett's or to Dr. Wellesley's back doors. and by people going to the police office it is scarcely used at all. There is no traffic along it. On Sundays, of course, it is used by people going to the services at St. Lawrence." "Would it be likely to be quiet, unfrequented of an evening?" "Emphatically, yes." "Do you think it likely that any person wishing to enter the Moot Hall unobserved, and seeing Mrs. Bunning go away from her rooms and round the corner to the Chancellor vaults, as we've just heard she did, could slip in unseen?" "Oh, to be sure," affirmed Krevin. "The easiest thing in the world. If I may suggest something?" Go on," said the Coroner, waving his spectacles. "Anything that helps. Suggest what you like." "Well," said Krevin, slowly and thoughtfully, "if I may put it in my own way. Suppose that there is somebody in the town who is desirous of finding the late Mayor alone in the Mayor's Parlour, being also cognizant of the fact, well known to many people, that the late Mr. Wallingford was to be found there every evening? Suppose, too, that that person was well acquainted with the geography of St. Lawrence Lane and the Moot Hall? Suppose, further, that he or she was also familiar with the fact that Mrs. Bunning invariably went out every evening to fetch the supper beer from the Chancellor vaults? Such a person could easily enter the Bunnings' back door with an absolutely minimum risk of detection. The churchyard of St. Lawrence is edged with thick shrubs and trees. Anybody could easily hide amongst the shrub, laurel, myrtle, ivy, watch for Mrs. Bunnings going out, and, when she had gone, slip across the lane, a very narrow one, and enter the door which, as she says, she left open. It would not take 2 minutes for any person who knew the place to pass from St. Lawrence churchyard to the Mayor's Parlour, or from the Mayor's Parlour to St. Lawrence churchyard." A murmur of comprehension and understanding ran round the court. Most of the people present knew St. Lawrence Lane and the Moot Hall as well as Krevin Crood knew them. His suggestion appealed to their common sense. And Tansley, with a sudden start, turned to Brent. "That's done it," he whispered. "Everybody tumbles to that. We've been going off on all sorts of side tracks all the morning. Now Wellesley, now Mrs. Mallett, and now here's another. Access to the Mayor's Parlour there you are. Easy as winking, on Krevin Crood's theory. Lay you a fiver to a shilling old Seagrave won't go on any farther." Herein Tansley was quickly proved to be right. The Coroner was showing unmistakable symptoms of his satiety for the time being. He thanked Krevin Crood punctiliously for his assistance, and once again toying restlessly with his spectacles, turned to the jury, who, on their part, looked blank and doubtful. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "it seems to me that the entire complexion of this matter is changed by the evidence we have heard since Mrs. Mallett broke in so unexpectedly upon what I was saying to you. I don't propose now to say any more as regards the evidence of either Dr. Wellesley or Mrs. Mallett. Since we heard what they have had to say, we have learnt a good deal which I think will be found to have more importance than we attach to it at present. As matters stand, the evidence of Mrs. Bunning is of supreme importance. There is no doubt whatever that there was easy means of access to the Mayor's Parlour during that half hour wherein the Mayor met his death. The mystery of the whole affair has deepened considerably during to day's proceedings, and instead of bringing this inquiry to a definite conclusion, I feel that I must wait for more evidence. I adjourn this inquest for a month from to day." The court cleared. The spectators filtered out into the market place in various moods and under different degrees of excitement. Some were openly disappointed that the jury had not been allowed to return a verdict. Some were vehement in declaring that the jury never would return a verdict. Here and there were men who wagged their heads sagely and remarked with sinister smiles that they knew what they thought about it. But within the rapidly emptying court, Brent, Tansley and Hawthwaite were grouped around Meeking. The barrister was indulging in some private remarks upon the morning's proceedings, chiefly addressed to the police superintendent. "There's no doubt about it, you know," he was saying. "The evidence of the Bunning woman, supplemented by what Krevin Crood said, which was a mere formal crystallizing of common knowledge, has altered the whole thing. Here's the back entrance to the Moot Hall left absolutely unprotected, unguarded, unwatched, whatever you like to call it, for half an hour, the critical half hour. Of course the murderer got up to the Mayor's Parlour that way, and got away by the same means. You're as far off as ever, Hawthwaite, and it's a pity you wasted time on that jealousy business. I watched Wellesley closely, and I believe that he spoke the truth when he said that whatever there might have been, there was no jealousy about Mrs. Saumarez between him and Wallingford at the end. My own impression is that Wellesley was clear off with Mrs. Saumarez." Hawthwaite, essentially a man of fixed ideas, looked sullen. "Well, it isn't mine, then," he growled, "from all I've learned, and I've chances and opportunities that most folks haven't. My impression is that both men were after her right up to the time Wallingford was murdered. I can tell you this, and I could have put it in evidence if I thought it worth while. Wellesley used to go and see her of an evening, constantly, up to a very recent date, though she was supposed to have broken off with him and to be on with the Mayor. Now then." "Do you know that for a fact, Hawthwaite?" asked Tansley. "I know it for a fact. He used to go there late at night and stop late. If you want to know where I got it was from a young woman that used to be housemaid at the Abbey House, Mrs. Saumarez's place. She's told me a lot. Both Wallingford and Wellesley used to visit there a good deal, but, as I say, Wellesley used to go there very late of an evening. This young woman says that she knows for a fact that he was often with her mistress till close on midnight. I don't care twopence what Wellesley said. I believe he was, and is, after her, and of course he'd be jealous enough about her being so friendly with Wallingford. There's a deal more in all this than's come out yet, let me tell you that." "I don't think anybody will contradict you, Hawthwaite," observed the barrister dryly. "But the pertinent fact is what I tell you, the fact of access. Somebody got to the Mayor's Parlour by way of the back staircase through Bunning's rooms that evening. Who was it? That's what you've got to find out. If you'd only found out before now that Mrs. Bunning took half an hour to fetch the supper beer that night, we should have been spared a lot of talk this morning. As things are, we're as wise as ever." Then Meeking, with a cynical laugh, picked up his papers and went off, and Brent, leaving Tansley talking to the superintendent, who was inclined to be huffy, strolled out of the Moot Hall and went round to the back, with the idea of seeing for himself the narrow street which Krevin Crood had formerly described. He saw at once that Krevin was an admirable exponent of the art of description. Everything in St. Lawrence Lane was as the ex-official had said. There was the door into the Bunnings' rooms, and there facing it the ancient church and its equally ancient churchyard. It was to the churchyard that Brent gave most attention. He immediately realised that Krevin Crood was quite right in speaking of it as a place wherein anybody could conveniently hide. A dark, gloomy, sheltered, high-walled place, filled with thick shrubbery, out of which here and there grew sombre yew trees, some of them of an antiquity as venerable as that of the church itself. It would be a very easy thing indeed, Brent decided, for any designing person to hide amongst these trees and shrubs, watch the Bunnings' door until Mrs. Bunning left it, jug in hand, and then to slip across the grass-grown, cobble-paved lane, silent and lonely enough, and up to the Mayor's Parlour. But all that presupposed knowledge of the place, and of its people and their movements. He went back to the market-place and towards the Chancellor. Peppermore came hurrying out of the hotel as Brent turned into it. He carried a folded paper in his hand, and he waved it at Brent as, at the sight of him, he came to a sudden halt. "Just been looking for you, Mr. Brent," he said mysteriously. "Come into some quiet spot, sir, and glance at this. Here we are, sir, corner of the hall." He drew Brent into an alcove that opened close by them, and affecting a mysterious air began to unfold his paper, a sheet of newsprint which, Brent's professional eye was quick to see, had just been pulled as a proof. "All that affair to day, Mr. Brent," he whispered. "Most unsatisfactory, sir, most unsatisfactory. Unconvincing, inconclusive, Mr. Brent. The thing's getting no farther, sir, no farther, except of course for the very pertinent fact about Mrs. Bunning's absence from her quarters that fateful evening. My own impression, sir, is that Hawthwaite and all the rest of 'em don't know the right way of going about this business. But the Monitor's going to wade in, sir, the Monitor is coming to the rescue. Look here, sir, we're going to publish a special edition to night with a full account of to day's proceedings at the inquest, and with it we're going to give away as a gratis supplement what do you think, sir? This, produced at great cost, sir, in the interest of justice. Look at it." Therewith Peppermore, first convincing himself that he and his companion were secure from observation, spread out before Brent a square sheet of very damp paper, strongly redolent of printer's ink, at the head of which appeared in big, bold, black characters the question: "Who typed this letter?" Beneath it, excellently reproduced, was a facsimile of the typewritten letter which Wallingford had shown to Epplewhite and afterwards left in his keeping. And beneath that was a note in large italics inviting anyone who could give any information as to the origin of the document to communicate with the editor of the Monitor at once. "What do you think of that for a coup, Mr. Brent?" demanded Peppermore proudly. "Up to Fleet Street form, that, sir, ain't it? I borrowed the original, sir, had it carefully reproduced in facsimile, and persuaded my proprietor to go to the expense of having sufficient copies struck off on this specially prepared paper to give one away with every copy of the Monitor that we shall print to-night. 5,000 copies, Mr. Brent! That facsimile, sir, will be all over Hathelsborough by supper time." "Smart!" observed Brent. "Top hole idea, Peppermore. And you hope—" "There aren't so many typewriters in Hathelsborough as all that," replied Peppermore. "I hope that somebody'll come forward who can tell something. Do you notice, sir, that this has been done, the original, I mean, on an old fashioned machine, and that the lettering is considerably worn, sir? I hope the Monitor's efforts will solve the mystery." "Much obliged to you," said Brent. "There's a lot of spade work to do yet." He was thinking over the best methods of further attempts on that spade work when, late that evening, he received a note from Queenie Crood. It was confined to one line: "Tomorrow, usual place, 3, urgent. Q." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Castle Wall. Brent went to bed that night wondering what it was that Queenie Crood wanted. Since their first meeting in the Castle grounds they had met frequently. He was getting interested in Queenie; she developed on acquaintance. Instead of being the meek and mild mouse of Simon Crood's domestic hearth that Brent had fancied her to be on his visit to the tannery, he was discovering possibilities in her that he had not suspected. She had spirit, an imagination, and a continually rebellious desire to get out of Simon Crood's cage and spread her wings in flight, anywhere so long as Hathelsborough was left behind. She had told Brent plainly that she had thought him foolish for buying property in the town. What was there in that rotten old borough, said Queenie, to keep any man of spirit and enterprise there? Brent argued the point in his downright way. It was his job, he conceived, to take up his cousin's work where it had been laid down. He was going to regenerate Hathelsborough. "And that you'll never do," affirmed Queenie. "You might as well try to blow up the Castle Keep with a halfpenny cracker. Hathelsborough people are like the man in the Bible. They're joined to their idols. You can try, and you'll only break your heart, or your back, in the effort, just as Wallingford would have done. If Wallingford had been a wise man, he'd have let Hathelsborough go to the devil in its own way. Then he'd have been alive now." "Well, I'm going to try," declared Brent. "I said I would, and I will. You wait till I'm elected to the Town Council. Then we'll see." "It's fighting a den of wild beasts," said Queenie. "You won't have a rag left on you when they're through with you." She used to tell him at these meetings of the machinations of Simon Crood and Coppinger and Mallett against his chances of success in the Castle Ward election. According to her, they were moving heaven and earth to prevent him from succeeding Wallingford. Evidently believing Queenie to be a tame bird that carried no tails, they were given to talking freely before her during their nightly conclaves. Brent heard a good deal about the underhand methods in which municipal elections are carried on in small country towns, and was almost as much amused as amazed at the unblushing corruption and chicanery of which Queenie told him. And now he fancied that she had some special news of a similar sort to give him. The election was close at hand, and he knew that Simon and his gang were desperately anxious to defeat him. Although Simon had been elected to the mayoralty, his party in the Town Council was in a parlous position. At present it had a majority of 1. If Brent were elected, that majority would disappear, and there were signs that at the annual elections in the coming November it would be transformed into a minority. Moreover, the opponent whom Brent had to face in this by-election was a strong man, a well-known, highly respected ratepayer, who, though an adherent of the old party, was a fair-minded and moderate politician, and likely to secure the suffrages of the non-party electors. It was going to be a stiff fight, and Brent was thankful for the occasional insights into the opposition's plans of campaign which Queenie was able to give him. But there were other things than this to think about, and he thought much as he lay wakeful in bed that night and as he dressed next morning. The proceedings at the adjourned inquest had puzzled him, left him doubtful and uncertain. He was not sure about the jealousy theory. He was not sure about Mrs. Saumarez, from what he had seen of her personally and from what he had heard of her. He was inclined to believe that she was not only a dabbler in politics, with a liking for influencing men who were concerned in them, but that she was also the sort of woman who likes to have more than one man in leash. He was now disposed to think that there had been love passages between her and Wallingford, and not only between her and Wallingford, but between her and Wellesley. There might, after all, be something in the jealousy idea. But then came in the curious episode of Mrs. Mallett, and the mystery attaching to it. As things presented themselves at present, there seemed to be no chance whatever that either Mrs. Mallett or Wellesley would lift the veil on what was evidently a secret between them. The only satisfactory and straightforward feature about yesterday's proceedings, he thought, was the testimony of Mrs. Bunning as to her unguarded door. Now, at any rate, it was a sure thing that there had been ready means of access to the Mayor's Parlour that evening. What was necessary was to discover who it was that had taken advantage of them. After breakfast, Brent went round to see Hawthwaite. Hawthwaite gave him a chair and eyed him expectantly. "We don't seem to be going very fast ahead," remarked Brent. "Mr. Brent!" exclaimed Hawthwaite. "I assure you we're doing all we can. But did you ever know a more puzzling case? Between you and me, I'm not at all convinced about either Dr. Wellesley or Mrs. Mallett. There's a mystery there which I can't make out. They may have said the truth, and they mayn't, and—" "Cut them out," interrupted Brent. "For the time being, anyway. We got some direct evidence yesterday, for the first time." "As how?" questioned Hawthwaite. "That door into Bunning's room," replied Brent. "That's where the murderer slipped in." "Aye, but did he?" said Hawthwaite. "If one could be certain—" "Look here," asserted Brent. "There is one thing that is certain, dead certain. That handkerchief." "Well?" asked Hawthwaite. "That should be followed up more," continued Brent. "There's no doubt whatever that that handkerchief, which Wellesley admits is his, got sent by mistake to one or other of Mrs. Marriner's other customers. That's flat. Now you can trace it." "How?" exclaimed Hawthwaite. "A small article like that?" "It can be done with patience," said Brent. "It's got to be done. That handkerchief got into somebody's hands. That somebody is probably the murderer. As to how it can be traced, well, I suggest this. As far as I'm conversant with laundry matters, families, such as Mrs. Mariner says she works for, have laundry books. These books are checked, I believe, when the washing's sent home. If there's an article missing, the person who does the checking notes it. If a wrong article's enclosed, that too is noted and returned to the laundry." "If Wellesley's handkerchief got to the wrong place, why wasn't it returned?" demanded Hawthwaite. "To be sure, but that's just what you've got to find out," retorted Brent. "You ought to go to Mrs. Mariner's laundry and make an exhaustive search of her books, lists and so on, till you get some light. See?" "Mrs. Mariner has, I should say, 100 customers," remarked Hawthwaite. "Don't matter if Mrs. Mariner's got 500 customers," said Brent. "That's got to be seen into. If you aren't going to do it, I will. Whoever it was that was in that Mayor's Parlour tried to burn a blood-stained handkerchief there. That handkerchief was Wellesley's. Wellesley swears he was never near the Mayor's Parlour. I believe him. So that handkerchief got by error into the box or basket of some other customer of Mrs. Mariner. Trace it." He rose and moved towards the door, and Hawthwaite nodded. "We'll make a try at it, Mr. Brent," he said. "But, as I say, to work on a slight clue like that—" "I've known of far slighter clues," replied Brent. Yet as he went away he reflected on the extreme thinness of this clue. It was possible that the handkerchief had passed through more hands than one before settling in those of the person who had thrown it on the hearth, stained with Wallingford's blood, in the Mayor's Parlour. But it was a clue, and, in Brent's opinion, the clue. One fact in relation to it had always struck him forcibly. The murderer of his cousin was either a very careless and thoughtless person, or had been obliged to quit the Mayor's Parlour very hurriedly. Anyone meticulously particular about destroying clues or covering up traces would have seen to it that the handkerchief was completely burnt up before leaving the room. As it was, it seemed to Brent that the murderer had either thrown the handkerchief on the hearth, seen it catch fire, and paid no more attention to it, which would denote carelessness, or had quitted the place immediately after flinging it aside, which would imply that some sound from without had startled him or her. And was it him or was it her? There were certain features of the case which had inclined Brent of late to speculating on the possibility that his cousin had been murdered by a woman. And to be sure, a woman was now in the case Mrs. Mallett. If only he knew why Mrs. Mallett went to see the doctor and the Mayor. But that, after all, was mere speculation, and he had a busy morning before him in relation to his election business. He had been continuously engaged all the time when at 3 o'clock he hurried to the Castle grounds to meet Queenie. He found her in her usual haunt, a quiet spot in the angle of a wall where she was accustomed to sit and read. "Well, and why urgent?" asked Brent as he dropped on the seat at her side. "To make sure that you'd come," retorted Queenie. "Didn't want to leave it to chance." "I'm here," said Brent. "Go ahead with the business." "Did you see the Monitor last night, and that facsimile they gave away with it?" inquired Queenie. "I did. Saw the facsimile before it was published. Peppermore showed it to me." "Very well. That's the urgent business. I know whose machine that letter the original, I mean was typed on." "You do? Great Scott! Whose, then?" "Uncle Simon Crood's. Fact." "Whew! So the old fossil's got such a modern invention as a typewriter, has he? And you think—" "Don't think. I know. He's had a typewriter for years. It's an old-fashioned thing, a good deal worn out. He rarely uses it, but now and then he operates with one finger, slowly. And that letter originated from him, his machine." "Proof," said Brent. Queenie took up a book that lay on the seat between them, and from it extracted a folded copy of the Monitor's facsimile. She leaned nearer to Brent. "Now look," she said. "Do you notice that 2 or 3 of the letters are broken? That M, part of it's gone. That O, half made. The top of that A is missing. More noticeable still, do you see that small T there is slanting the wrong way? Well, all that's on Uncle Simon's machine. I knew where that letter had originated as soon as ever I saw this facsimile last night." She laid aside the supplement, and once more opening her book, produced a sheet of paper. "Look at this," she continued. "When Uncle Simon went out to the tannery this morning, I just took advantage of his absence to type out the alphabet on his machine. Now then, you glance over that and compare the faulty letters with those in the facsimile. What do you say now?" "You're a smart girl, Queenie," said Brent. "You're just the sort of girl I've been wanting to meet, the sort that can see things when they're right in front of her eyes. Oh, my! That's sure, positive proof that old Simon—" "Oh!" broke in Queenie sharply. "Oh, I say!" Before Brent could look up he was conscious that a big and bulky shadow had fallen across the gravelled path at their feet. He lifted his eyes. There, in his usual raiment of funereal black, his top hat at the back of his head, his hands behind him under the ample skirts of his frock coat, his broad, fat face heavy with righteous and affectedly sorrowful indignation, stood Simon Crood. His small, pig-like eyes were fixed on the papers which the two young people were comparing. "Hullo!" exclaimed Brent. He was quick to see that he and Queenie were in for a row, probably for a row of a decisive sort which would affect both their lives, and he purposely threw as much hearty insolence into his tone as he could summon. "Eavesdropping, eh, Mr. Crood?" Simon withdrew a hand from the sable folds behind him and waved it in lordly fashion. "I've no words to waste on impudent young fellers as comes from nobody knows where," he said loftily. "My words is addressed to my niece, as I see sitting there, a deceiving of her lawful relative and guardian. Go you home at once, miss." "Rot!" exclaimed Brent. "She'll go home when she likes, and not at all if she doesn't like. You stick where you are, Queenie. I'm here." And as if to prove the truth of his words, he slipped his right arm round Queenie's waist, clasped it tightly, and turned a defiant eye on Simon. "See that?" he said. "Well, that's just where Queenie stops as long as ever Queenie likes. Eh, Queenie?" The girl, reddening as Brent's arm slipped round her, instinctively laid her free hand on his wrist. And, as he appealed to her, he felt her fingers tighten there with a firm, understanding pressure. "That's all right," he whispered to her. "We've done it, girlie. It's for good." He looked up at Simon, whose mouth was opening with astonishment. "Queenie's my girl, old bird," he went on. "She isn't going anywhere, not anywhere at all, at anybody's bidding, unless she likes. And why shouldn't she be here?" It seemed, from the pause that followed, as if Simon would never find his tongue again. But at last he spoke. "So this here is what's been going on behind my back, is it, miss?" he demanded pointedly, ignoring Brent and fixing his gaze on Queenie. "Carrying on with strangers at my very gates, as you might say, and in public places in a town of which I'm chief magistrate? What sort of return do you call this, miss, I should like to know, for all that I've done for you, me that's lodged and boarded and clothed you ever since—" "What have I done for you in return?" demanded Queenie with a flash of spirit. "Saved you the wages of a couple of servants for all these years. But this is the end, if you're going to throw that in my teeth." Brent drew Queenie to her feet and turned her away from Simon. He gave the big man a look over his shoulder. "That's it, my friend," he said. "That's the right term. The end. Find somebody else to do your household drudgery. This young lady's done her last stroke for you. And now don't begin to bluster," he added, as Simon, purpling with wrath, shook his fist. "We'll just leave you to yourself." He led Queenie away down a side path, and once within its shelter, put a finger under her chin, and lifting her face, looked steadily at her. "Look here, girlie," he said. "You heard what I whispered to you just now? It's for good. Didn't I say that? Well, is it?" Queenie managed to get her eyes to turn on him at last. "Do you mean it?" she murmured. "I just do," answered Brent fervently. "Say the word." "Yes, then," whispered Queenie. She looked at him wonderingly when he had bent and kissed her. "You're an extraordinary man," she said. "Whatever am I going to do now? Homeless!" "Not much!" exclaimed Brent. "You come along with me, Queenie. I'm a good hand at thinking fast. I'll put you up warm and comfortable at Mother Appleyard's, and as quick as the thing can be done we'll be married. Got that into your little head? Come on, then!" That night Brent told Tansley of what had happened and what he was going to do. Tansley listened, laughed and shook his head. "All right, my lad," he said. "I've no doubt you and Queenie'll suit each other excellently. But you've settled your chances of winning the election, Brent. Simon Crood'll bring up every bit of his heavy artillery against you now, and will smash you." Chapter 17 of The Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This recording is in the public domain. Impregnable. Brent received this plain-spoken declaration with a curious tightening of lips and setting of jaw, which Tansley, during their brief acquaintance, had come to know well enough. They were accompanied by a fixed stare. The solicitor knew that too. These things meant that Brent's fighting spirit was roused and that his temper became ugly. Tansley laughed. "You're the sort of chap for a scrap, Brent," he continued, "and a go-ahead customer too. But you don't know this lot, nor their resources. Whatever anybody may say, and whatever men like your late cousin and Epplewhite and any of the so-called progressives I'm not one myself, it pays me to belong to neither party whatever these folks may think or say, Simon Crood and his lot are top dogs in this little old town. Vested interests, my boy, ancient tree with roots firmly fixed in the piled-up soil, strata upon strata of 1,000 years. You're not going to pull up these roots, my lad." "How'll Simon Crood smash me?" demanded Brent quietly. "As to the exact how," answered Tansley, "can't say. Mole work, but he'll set the majority of the electors in that Castle ward against you." "I've enough promises of support now to give me a majority," retorted Brent. "That for promises!" exclaimed Tansley, snapping his fingers. "You don't know Hathelsborough people. They'll promise you their support to your face, just to get rid of your presence on their doorsteps, and vote against you when they reach the ballot box. I'll lay anything most of the folk you've been to see have promised their support to both candidates." "Why should these people support Crood and his crew?" demanded Brent. "Because Crood and his crew represent the only god they worship," said Tansley, with a cynical laugh. "Brass, as they call it. All that a Hathelsborough man thinks about is brass money. Get money where you can, never mind how, as long as you can get it, and keep just within the law. Simon Crood represents the Hathelsborough principle of graft, and whatever you may think, he's the paramount influence in the town today." "He and his lot have only got the barest majority on the council," remarked Brent. "Maybe. But they've got all the really influential men behind 'em, the moneyed men," said Tansley, "and they've distributed all the various official posts, sinecures most of them, among their friends. That Town Trustee business is the nut to crack here, Brent, and a nut that's been hardening for centuries isn't going to be cracked with an ordinary implement. Come now, are you an extraordinary one?" "I'll make a try at things anyway," replied Brent, "and I don't believe I shall lose that election either." "You might have scraped in if you hadn't carried Simon Crood's niece away from under his very nose," said Tansley. "But now that you've brought personal matters into the quarrel, the old chap'll move every piece he has on the board to checkmate you. It won't do to have you on the council, Brent. You're too much of an innovator. Now, this town, the real town, doesn't want innovation. Innovation in an ancient borough like this is unsettling and uncomfortable. See?" "This world doesn't stand still," retorted Brent. "I'm going ahead." But he reflected, as he left the solicitor's office, that much of what Tansley had said was true. There was something baffling in the very atmosphere of Hathelsborough. He felt like a man who fights the wind. Everything was elusive, ungraspable, evasive. He seemed to get no further forward. And if Tansley was right in affirming that Hathelsborough people made promises which they had no intention of redeeming, his chances of getting a seat on the Town Council and setting to work to rebuild his late cousin's schemes of reformation were small indeed. But once more he set his jaw and nerved himself to endeavour, and, as the day of the election was now close at hand, plunged into the task of canvassing and persuading, wondering all the time, now that he had heard Tansley's cynical remarks, if the people to whom he talked and who were mostly plausible and ingratiating in their reception of him were in reality laughing at him for his pains. He saw little of the efforts of the other side, but Peppermore agreed with Tansley that the opposition would leave no stone unturned in the task of beating him. The Monitor was all for Brent. Peppermore's proprietor was a progressive, a tradesman who had bought up the Monitor for a mere song, and ran it as a business speculation which had so far turned out very satisfactorily. Consequently, Brent at this period went much to the Monitor office, and did things in concert with Peppermore, inspiring articles which, to say the least of them, were severely critical of the methods of the Crood regime. On one of these visits, Peppermore, in the middle of a discussion about one of these effusions, abruptly switched off the trend of his thought in another direction. "I'd a visit from Mrs. Saumarez this morning, Mr. Brent," he said, eyeing his companion with a knowing look. "Pretty and accomplished woman, that, sir, but queer, Mr. Brent, queer." "What do you mean?" asked Brent. "Odd ideas, sir, very odd," replied Peppermore. "Wanted to find out from me, Mr. Brent, if in case she's called up again at this inquest business, or if circumstances arise which necessitate police proceedings at which she might be a witness, her name couldn't be suppressed. Ever hear such a proposal, sir, to make to a journalist? Impossible, my dear madam, says I. Publicity, ma'am, I says, well, it's the very salt of life, as you might term it, I says. When gentlemen of our profession report public affairs, we keep nothing back, I says, firmly, sir. I very much object to my name figuring in these proceedings, she says. I object very strongly indeed. Can't help it, ma'am, says I. If the highest in the land was called into a witness box and I reported the case, I says, I should have to give the name. It's the glory of our profession, Mrs. Saumarez. I says, just as it's that of the law, that we don't countenance hole and corner business. The light of day, ma'am, the light of day. That's the idea, Mrs. Saumarez, I says. Let the clear, unclouded radiance of high noon, ma'am, shine on. But you know what I mean, Mr. Brent. As I said to her, the publicity that's attendant on all this sort of thing in England is one of the very finest of our national institutions. Odd, sir, but for a woman that's supposed to be modern and progressive, she didn't agree. I don't want to see my name in the papers in connection with this affair, Mr. Peppermore, she declared again. I thought perhaps, she says, rather coaxingly, that you could suggest some way of keeping it out if there are any further proceedings. Can't, ma'am, says I. If such an eventuality comes to be, it'll be my duty to record faithfully and fully in the Monitor whatever takes place. Oh, says she, but it's not the Monitor that I so much object to. It's the London papers. I understand that you supply the reports to them, Mr. Peppermore. Well, of course, as you know, Mr. Brent, I am district correspondent for two of the big London agencies, but I had to explain to her that in a sensational case like this, the London papers generally sent down men of their own. There were, for instance, 2 or 3 London reporters present the other day. Yes, she said, so she'd heard, and she'd got all the London papers to see if her name was mentioned, and had been relieved to find that it hadn't. There were nothing but summarized reports. Her name hadn't appeared anywhere but in the Monitor. And what I wanted, Mr. Peppermore, she says, more wheedlingly than ever, was that, if it lay in your power, and if occasion arises, you would do what you could to keep my name out of it. I don't want publicity. Concluded Peppermore. Pretty woman, Mr. Brent, and with taking ways, but of course I had to be adamant, sir, firm, Mr. Brent, firm as St. Hathelswide's tower. The press, Mrs. Saumarez, I says, as I dismissed the matter, politely, of course, has its duties. It can make no exception, Mrs. Saumarez, to wealth or rank or beauty. I made her a nice bow, Mr. Brent, as I spoke the last word. But she wasn't impressed. As I say, queer woman. What's publicity matter to her as long as she's no more than a witness?" Brent was not particularly impressed by Peppermore's story. He saw nothing in it beyond the natural desire of a sensitive, highly strung woman to keep herself aloof from an unpleasant episode, and he said so. "I don't see what good Hawthwaite hoped to get by ever calling Mrs. Saumarez before the Coroner," he added. "She told nothing that everybody didn't know. What did it all amount to?" "Aye, but that's just it in a town like this, Mr. Brent," answered Peppermore with a wink. "I can tell you why the police put the Coroner up to calling Mrs. Saumarez as a witness. They'd got a theory that Wellesley killed your cousin in a fit of jealousy, of which she was the cause, and they hoped to substantiate it through her evidence. There's no doubt, sir, that there were love passages between Dr. Wellesley and this attractive lady, and between her and your cousin, but shall I tell you, sir, something that's in my mind?" "Aye, why not?" answered Brent. He was thinking of the thick pile of letters which he had returned to Mrs. Saumarez, and of the unmistakable love tokens which he had seen deposited with them in the casket wherein Wallingford had kept them. "What is it you're thinking of?" Peppermore edged his chair closer to his visitor's and lowered his voice. "I am not unobservant, Mr. Brent," he said. "Our profession, as you know, sir, leads us to the cultivation of that faculty. Now, I've thought a good deal about this matter, and I'll tell you a conclusion I've come to. Do you remember that when Dr. Wellesley was being questioned the other day, he was asked if there was jealousy between him and Mr. Wallingford about Mrs. Saumarez? To be sure. Now, what did he answer? He answered frankly that there had been, but it no longer existed. Do you know what I deduced from that, Mr. Brent? This, that the little lady had had both those men as strings to her bow at the same time, indecisive as to which of 'em she'd finally choose, but that, not so long since, she'd given up both in favour of a third man." "Ingenious, Peppermore, very ingenious," he said. "Given 'em both the mitten, as they say? But the third man?" "Mrs. Saumarez was away on the Continent most of the winter," answered Peppermore. "The Riviera, Nice, Monte Carlo, that sort of thing. She may have met somebody there that she preferred to either Wellesley or Wallingford. Anyway, Mr. Brent, what did the doctor mean when he frankly admitted that there had been jealousy between him and Wallingford, but that it no longer existed? He meant, I take it, that there was no reason for its further existence. That implies that another man had come into the arena." "Aye, but does it?" said Brent. "It might mean something else that she'd finally accepted Wellesley, eh?" "No," declared Peppermore. "She's not engaged to Wellesley. I'll lay anything she isn't, Mr. Brent. There's a third man, somewhere in the background, and it's my opinion that that's the reason why she doesn't want the publicity she came to me about." Brent fell into a new train of thought, more or less confused. Mrs. Saumarez's talk to him about Wallingford and the letters and the things in the casket were all mixed up in it. "Had you any opportunity of seeing Wellesley and my cousin together during the last week or two before my cousin's death?" he asked presently. "Several, Mr. Brent, several opportunities," answered Peppermore. "I went to report the proceedings of 2 or 3 committees of the Town Council during the fortnight preceding that lamentable occurrence, sir, and saw them at close quarters. I saw them frequently at the club of which I am a member. I should say, sir, from what I observed, that they were on very good terms with each other, more friendly than ever, Mr. Brent." "H'm," said Brent. "Well, there's a lot of queer stuff about this business, Peppermore. But let's get back to that of the moment. Look here, I've got a fine notion for your Monitor. You'll just have time to get it out before my election day. Let's make a real, vigorous, uncompromising attack on the principle of the Town Trustee business. Will not say one word about the present trustees, old Crood, Mallett and Coppinger. Will have no personalities and make up no charges. Will avoid all stuff of that sort. Will just attack the thing on its principle, taking up the line that it's a bad principle that the finances of a borough should be entrusted to the sole control of 3 men responsible to nobody, and with the power, if one dies, to elect his successor. Let's argue it out on the principle. Then later we'll have another article on the argument that the finances of a town should be wholly controlled by the elected representatives of the people. See?" "Your late cousin's theories, Mr. Brent," said Peppermore. "Excellent notions both, sir. You write the articles, I'll find the space. All on principle, no personalities. Plain and practical, Mr. Brent, let them be, so that everybody can understand. Though to be sure," he added regretfully, "what our readers most like is personalities. If we dared to slate old Crood with all the abuse we could lay our pens to, the readers of the Monitor, sir, would hug themselves with pleasure. But libel, Mr. Brent, libel. Do you know, sir, that ever since I occupied the editorial chair of State, I have always felt that the wet blanket of the law of libel sat at my banquet like the ghost in Macbeth, letting its sword hang by a thread an inch from my cranium. Bit mixed in my metaphors, sir, but you know what I mean. Mustn't involve my respected proprietor in a libel suit, Mr. Brent, so stick to abstract principles, sir, and eschew those saucy personal touches which, I regret deeply, I can't print." Brent had no intention of indulging in personalities in his warfare with Simon Crood and the reactionaries, but as the day of the election approached he discovered that his adversaries were not at all particular about putting forth highly personal references to himself. Hathelsborough suddenly became flooded with handbills and posters, each bearing a few pithy words in enormous type. These effusions were for the most part in the form of questions, addressed to the recipients. There was a cynical and sinister sneer in all of them. Who is Mr. Brent? Why support a stranger? Who wants a carpetbagger? Vote for the home-made article. Hathelsborough men for Hathelsborough matters. Stand by the true and tried. These appeals to the free and enlightened burgesses whose suffrages he solicited met Brent on every side, and especially on the day of the election. He had gone in for nothing of this sort himself. His original election address, it seemed to him, contained everything that he had to say, and beyond posting it all over the town in great placards and distributing it in the form of handbills to the electors of the Castle Ward, he had issued nothing in the shape of literature. But he had stumped his desired constituency thoroughly, making speeches at every street corner and at every public meeting place, and he had a personal conviction from his usual reception on these occasions that the people were with him. He was still sure of victory when, at noon on the polling day, he chanced to meet Tansley. "Going strong, as far as I can make out," he answered, in response to the solicitor's inquiry. "I've been about all the morning, and from what I've seen and what my committee tell me, I'm in." Tansley shook his head. "Look here, my lad," he said, drawing Brent aside, as they stood together in the market-place, "don't you build too high. They're working against you to-day, the Crood gang, as they never worked in their lives. They're bringing every influence they can get hold of against you. And you haven't been over-wise." "What have I done now?" demanded Brent. "Those articles that are appearing in the Monitor," replied Tansley. "Everybody knows they're yours. Do you think there's a soul in Hathelsborough who believes that Peppermore could write them? Now, they're a mistake. They may be true." "They are true," growled Brent. "Granted. But however true they are, they're an attack on Hathelsborough," said Tansley. "Now, of whatever political colour they are, Hathelsborough folk are Hathelsborough folk, and they're prouder of this old town than you know. Look round you, my lad. There isn't a stone that you can see that wasn't just where it is now hundreds of years before you were born. Do you think these people like to hear you, a stranger, criticising their old customs, old privileges, as you are doing in those articles? Not a bit of it. They're asking who you are to come judging them. You'd have done a lot better, Brent, if you'd been a bit diplomatic. You should have left all politics and reforms out of it, and tried to win the seat simply on your relationship to Wallingford. You could have shown your cards when you got in. You've shown 'em too soon." "That be damned," said Brent. "I've played the game straightforwardly, anyhow. I don't want any underhand business. There's enough of that in this rotten place now. And I still think I shall be in." But before the summer evening had progressed far, Brent learned that the vested interests of an ancient English borough are stronger than he thought. He was hopelessly defeated. Only rather more than 100 voters marked their papers for him. His opponent was returned by a big majority. He got a new idea when he heard the result, and went straight off to Peppermore and the Monitor with it. They would go on with the articles, and make them of such a nature that the Local Government Board in London would find it absolutely necessary to give prompt and searching attention to Hathelsborough and its affairs. Chapter 18